Many a year ago, when FNAF was still a ye little baby, Scott Cawthon made a post on Reddit simply titled The Retcon Issue. In the post, he claims that he doesn't recklessly change details of the story on a whim, contrary to what some may believe, and that there's only ever been one retcon he made throughout the entire series. Now, to put it in perspective, this post was made in September of 2017, long after Sister Location's release, but a little bit before Pizzeria Simulator came out in December. Now, depending on who you ask, that one retcon statement might be just a little bit outdated, considering everything else that's come out since then. But we're going to approach this topic with just these original 5 games in mind, since this is what was out at the time of the post. There are some other things Scott mentions in that post that I think are worthwhile to keep in mind. Quote, "There have been other times, however, when my original intentions didn't come across clearly. In those instances, I make a point to clarify in the next game. That's not really a retcon, it's simply an attempt to guide the story toward where it was originally intended to go." End quote. He goes on to also say that there was a misconception about FNAF 4 that he cleared up in Sister Location. That's not important at the moment, but I do want to bring it up later. The other thing I'd like to call attention to is what he says in the 3rd paragraph. Quote, "So, while it's true that the story has developed new details over time that may not have been planned from the beginning, that doesn't mean that the pieces don't fit together as a whole." End quote. I think this is really important, and I think it's something a lot of people don't understand or don't realize. Just because a few pieces aren't fitting together in the puzzle you're crafting, it doesn't mean that the pieces are wrong. It means our way of trying to solve it might just need some readjustment. I think a good example of this is what I mentioned before about an apparent misconception about FNAF 4. I'm willing to bet that he's talking about dream theory when he says that in his post. Sister Location has a very clear connection to FNAF 4 via the private room cameras that you can turn on to see the FNAF 4 bedroom and plush trap hallway. In the simplest way possible so we don't go off on a tangent, this just clarifies that no, FNAF 4 wasn't just a dream inside some kid's head, nor were the other games. Take that as you will, of course, but the evidence is staring us right in the face. There it is, that bedroom, clear as day for us to see. This is an example of Scott clarifying something as he said in the post, but it can also be used as an example of people needing to readjust their lines of thinking, because a lot of people really thought that dream theory was the canonical answer, and that Scott simply changed the story because, oops, MatPat got it right. There's a really bad stigma there that is honestly kind of annoying. No, Scott didn't change or retcon the story because one theorist got the right answer or something close to it. Actually, he even went on record to say that nobody got FNAF 4 right, as opposed to the previous games where most fans were able to solve everything quite quickly. Essentially, this has been me going through a very drawn out way of saying no, dream theory is not the retcon Scott spoke of in his post. However, my point is also that there is a difference between retcon and clarification, the latter of which is something FNAF does a lot of. FNAF also does a lot of something called retroactive storytelling. An example of retroactive storytelling in FNAF would be the Bite of 87. In FNAF 1, we briefly hear about this incident that happened at Freddy's, involving an animatronic biting someone's frontal lobe. And then in FNAF 2, which takes place in 1987, we play as a security guard that, at the end of the game, gets moved to the day shift and he has to stay close to the animatronics. Basically, it's heavily implied that Jimmy Fitzgerald is the victim of the Bite of 87. However, we also know that Scott didn't plan for sequels when he made FNAF 1. Jimmy Fitzgerald, or FNAF 2 at all, did not exist when he made the first game. Is that a retcon? No, it's just details that didn't exist when he mentally birthed the concept of Five Nights at Freddy's. The reason I bring this all up before getting into the actual candidates for what the retcon might be is because I think it's important to make the distinction between what is a retcon, what is clarification, and what is retroactive storytelling. Now, clarification and retro storytelling are similar, but here there is a slight difference. A retcon is easy enough to comprehend. It's when a story cements one idea very solidly, only to change or alter this firm idea in a way that's totally different from the original concept. An example would be William Afton's name. Has this ever been retconned? No, but let's say Scott decided to seriously change it to something else like Bob or Jeff. Suddenly, the guy people were calling Afton is being called something totally different, and they proceed to do that throughout the rest of the story. Again, an example of clarification would be that FNAF 4 misconception. People thought FNAF 4 was a dream, and Scott used his next game to affirm that it's not. Like he said, he sometimes has to guide people towards the actual intention he was trying to get across by using his next releases to clarify stuff from his old ones. Retroactive storytelling isn't necessarily clarification. Back in the day, nobody was really ever wondering about who Purple Guy was exactly. At most, he was just another security guard. But as we got more games and books, we were given a name to put to a face, and we found out that Purple Guy was actually the co-founder of Freddy's. These are details that might have not been planned at the start, but they're not retcons either, nor are they trying to lead anyone to a certain consensus that might have been originally misinterpreted by the fandom. With that out of the way, I'd like to go over the most likely options for what Scott's one retcon might be. Now, I tried to ask people what their opinions on the topic were, so that I could get a good understanding of the different takes. But of course, I can only include so many choices in one video. If you have your own take on what the one retcon might be, feel free to comment it down below. At the end of the video, I'll obviously go into what my own take on the topic is, but before that, let's go over the rest. This, without a shadow of a doubt, is the answer I got most when asking around what people thought might be the retcon. For those who are unaware, there's various newspaper clippings that you can spot in FNAF 1 that will appear in the East Hall cam. One of the newspapers talks about two children being lured into the back room of Freddy's by a man dressed in a mascot costume, and that surveillance footage was used to identify the culprit, which led to his capture the following morning. Another newspaper talks about 5 children being reported missing, and that while the suspect has been charged and convicted, the bodies were never found. We'll get to the specifics in a mo, but the idea here is that a lot of people think Afton's legal conviction was retconned out of the story, because it doesn't really come up again. For all intents and purposes, Afton seems to have gotten away with his crimes scot-free. However, that's not entirely true. In the Silverized novel, it's even said that Afton was arrested after the crime. Clay Burke, the officer that arrested Afton at the time, even says that he was sure that the man was guilty. But again, the bodies of the children were never found. The story basically says that the police knew that Afton committed the crime, but they had no evidence to convict him of an actual murder. This is where I think it gets a bit messy for a lot of people. So yes, they couldn't convict Afton of a murder, but the newspaper in FNAF 1 says that Afton was convicted. It's easy to see why people might think that Scott retconned Afton being convicted or charged with anything. We're about to bring a little bit of real-world information into this discussion, so bear with me. For starters, it is very difficult to convict someone of a murder when you don't even have the bodies. If you don't even have a body or evidence that anyone died, then it can't be confidently said that a murder even took place. These types of cases usually rely on strong circumstantial evidence and forensics. Still, it's an uphill battle. However, being convicted doesn't automatically mean jail time. A judge will determine a sentence based on the severity of the crime you're being charged with, and that could include things such as jail time, probation, or community service. However, conviction in of itself simply means that you've been found guilty of whatever crime you've been charged with. Now, Granted, we don't know the specifics of what Afton's court case might have been. However, let's go over what we do know. For starters, we know that cameras actually did catch Afton on camera luring the children into the back room while donning a mascot costume. We know from the FNAF 3 phone calls that the room Afton most likely led the children into had no cameras in it, so the actual alleged murder or whatever happened to the kids wasn't caught on tape. We know Afton was arrested, but the bodies of the children were never found, and because of this fact, he was inevitably let off without much consequence. However, if Afton was actually convicted, what might have been the charge? Well, if you aren't aware, someone can be charged for multiple different crimes in a single court case. The term multiple counts might ring a bell. For example, Afton could be charged with 5 counts of first-degree murder, but also have 5 counts of child endangerment, or a charge for the intent to cause harm. Afton could be found innocent of murder, but he could be successfully convicted when it comes to the child endangerment charges. Now, let's be real, this is totally speculation. Again, we don't know exactly what Afton would have been charged with, but I do think it's important to keep in mind that Afton was seen luring the children on camera at the very least, and we do have an instance of him being arrested after the crime. There is something else I'd like to bring up, and that's the facial recognition software from FNAF 2. Common knowledge by now, but one of the high-tech draws of the toy animatronics was that they had a built-in facial recognition software that was wired into a criminal database. Essentially, they could detect registered offenders and criminals because the faces would be in that database. This, of course, was done as a safety precaution after what happened at the previous location that closed in 1985. You might be able to guess what might have happened there. So here's the question. If Afton was convicted, why wouldn't he be recognized in the criminal database? Before I answer that question, I want to point out that it's interesting Scott felt inclined to include something like this. This is only the second installment in the franchise, yet by this point we can at least cement that an incident happened where 5 children went missing at Freddy's, and the company is still trying to shake that off their reputation. My point being that, like I said before, this software is supposed to help defend against known criminals. But if William was never convicted, why have it? It is a system that relies on a database of known criminals. The logic would be that the system would have the identity of the person who is responsible for the previous incident that happened at Freddy's. If the retcon was that William was never convicted, then what's the point of this? Now yes, you could argue that it was simply Fazbear Entertainment trying to invest in some sort of precautionary measure, but keep in mind that Afton saw it fit to work here under the guise of a security guard. Why would the co-founder of the company feel inclined to disguise himself in such a lower position? Well, maybe he isn't in that position of power anymore. Okay, but why would that be? Well, maybe he's in legal trouble regarding something that happened at Freddy's. Finally, we return back to the previous question. Why would the software not recognize William? In the Silver Eyes novel, William appears to be a very thin, lanky, and rather rough-looking man, but he didn't always look like this. Actually, they call attention to the fact that William used to be a much bigger fellow, but after everything that happened, he skipped town, and when he came back, he looked like this. There's similarities between them, but they do look very different. Furthermore, William works at the abandoned mall that houses the old Freddy's under the alias of Dave Miller. It's very possible that William worked under an alias when he was undercover at Freddy's in 1987. It's also possible that Afton looked different enough to slide under the radar. Whatever the case may be, I don't think Afton's conviction is the retcon Scott mentioned. I think a lot of people kind of just misunderstand what conviction means to begin with. Again, it doesn't just mean jail time. I already went into all of that earlier, of course. Now, let's move on to the next option. This one wasn't mentioned a lot by the people I asked, but it's one I actually do remember coming up a long time ago. You might be familiar with the Give Cake minigame from FNAF 2, in which you play as a version of Freddy giving cake to children. However, as you play, you'll notice a purple car pull up outside where a sobbing child also stands. Purple guy gets out of the car, kills the child, then drives away. With the gift of foreknowledge, we know that this is supposed to be Afton killing Charlie, and very soon after, this is when Charlie's soul possesses the puppet, as we see in the security puppet minigame from FFPS. During the minigame, you might also be able to make out the words "save him," spelled out in a very kind of robotic and plain tone. This is very odd considering we know for a fact that Charlie is a female. There is, of course, a slight catch. Although Charlie is female, the marionette is referred to as he. Take the Ultimate Custom Night description, for example, where it very clearly refers to the marionette as a male. This isn't the first time FNAF has played fast and loose with the genders of ghost children and which animatronic characters they haunt. For example, Cassidy is believed to be a female character, but the character she haunts, Golden Freddy, is a male animatronic. In the Silver Eyes continuity, Cassidy possesses Bonnie, so depending on the continuity we're talking about, the animatronics that the ghosts occupy is even subject to change. It might sound cheap, but you could justify the save him by saying that it's referring to the puppet. However, I will admit, if I had to choose an option aside my own, I do think this one is a viable choice. In the very first FNAF game, Phone Guy has an odd passing remark about the animatronics. Something about them singing the same stupid songs for 20 years. The reason this one is odd is because it's widely theorized that FNAF 1 takes place in 1993, although that's never necessarily been canonically confirmed. Freddy Fazbear specifically opened in 1983, and of course, had a few openings and closures since. However, Fredbear's most likely opened in the late 70s. Usually people go with 1979 being its opening year. Let's say that Fredbear's did open in 1979, and so about 14 years on from that would be 1993. But even if you don't feel confident in that, we could go with 1983 because we know for certain Freddy's opened in that year. That's even less though. But what if 1993 isn't actually the year FNAF 1 takes place? Now, God knows most people might disagree with me on this one, and to be fair, I'm not sure I believe it myself, but bear with me for the moment. In Five Nights at Freddy's the week before, we play as Phone Guy, aka Ralph. In it, we find out that Ralph has an 11-year-old daughter that is soon to be turning 12 by next month. This is important because we also find out that Ralph's daughter was born not long after he began working at Freddy's. And we know it was Freddy's that Ralph first worked at and not Fredbear's because Ralph says as much. Putting that aside for the moment, there's a little part of the story where Ralph is reminiscing about better times at Freddy's. Once upon a time, he would have said that Freddy's was the happiest place on Earth, but that would have been infringing on trademark. This is a reference to the tagline, "The happiest place on Earth," as trademarked by Disney. But although the tagline was created in 1955, it wasn't trademarked until September of 1998. So that means we have to do a little bit of math. Let's say Ralph began working at Freddy's in 1985. Well, 1985 plus 12 is 1997, a year before the aforementioned legal trademark happened. However, what if we added those 12 years from 1987? Well, that brings us to 1999. Now, I know what you're thinking. If Phone Guy really did start working at Freddy's in 1985 and Coppelia was born in 1987, that would mean she was born 2 years into Ralph's career. Ultimately, I think this part mostly depends on who you ask, to be honest. Let me put it this way. Let's say you work at a supermarket for 30 years, give or take. For that first year or two that you worked, would you say that was still recent in perspective to when you started the job, in the grand scheme of things? To be fair, I feel that's a very subjective question, and the answer would probably vary from person to person. Still, it does make Phone Guy's 20 years line make a lot more sense. 1979 plus 20 is exactly 1999. Or if you want to go off of the 1983 start point, it would be 16. Still a little short, but you can better justify Phone Guy maybe rounding up. Now, this all has some pretty big connotations for the rest of the timeline. I don't really want to get into that here though. What I will say is that we should always keep an open mind, and I will also say that the book remarks that Ralph doesn't really remember what year the first Freddy's opened, nor its predecessor Fredbear's. With that in mind, it's very possible this line is just him guesstimating. Could I have made life easier and just opened with that? Yes I could have. But it wouldn't have been educational and fun. But in any case, it's time to move on to my take for what the retcon might actually be. Strap in, folks, this might be controversial. You know, try as I might, somehow I always come back to this thing. For those who might be familiar with my previous theories, I've talked an exorbitant amount about Happiest Day and stuff surrounding it, like the Crying Child, FNAF World, etc. One day, I hope I escape needing to bring it up again, but until then, here we are. In FNAF 3, there are secret mini-games that you can play that help you get an alternate ending. In these mini-games, you give cake to various lost souls that, after receiving cake, appear in the Happiest Day level. Now, only one child remains, and with everybody gathered, we can now bestow upon him a delicious cake as well. After doing so, the spirits fade away, with their masks slowly falling to the floor. On the surface, you'd think this scene is pretty straightforward, right? It's the children's souls finally being set free after years of torment. Unfortunately, that's not the case, or at least it isn't anymore. In sister location, we see these animatronics come together to form the eldritch entity known as Ennard, and Ennard becomes Molten Freddy, which we see in FNAF 6. Obviously, FNAF 6 takes place after 3, so what's the gist here? Like I said before, I've already gone into this sort of stuff in other videos, so I'm not going into that crockpot here. The important part is that, once upon a time, FNAF 3 was the end to the story. For all intents and purposes, Happiest Day was when the souls were set free. Even though Springtrap seemingly survived the fire, this was still intended to be the finale. Scott has said as much in interviews that he originally envisioned FNAF as a trilogy after the first game took off. But because of people's opinions when it came to FNAF 3's lacking horror, specifically Springtrap's jump scare, he decided to make FNAF 4. Now, does this mean Happiest Day is completely and utterly useless? Is it non-canon? Does it serve any purpose? Don't get the wrong idea, it does have meaning and purpose in the story, it just doesn't serve the same purpose it once did. This, to me, feels like the biggest retcon you could figure from the series, considering that it literally was supposed to be the end. There's something I neglected to mention about Scott's post, something that he stated in it that I wanted to wait to bring up. That being the fact that, apparently, whatever the retcon is, it was integrated pretty seamlessly and went mostly unnoticed by the community. I think a lot of people would agree that it's hard to gauge what this exactly means, because a lot of the answers you could figure for what the retcon could be don't sound seamless or even unnoticed. It really depends on where you looked and also when. Granted, nowadays we as a community flop between topics every day, but I'm not confident I can recall anyone actually bringing up Phone Guy's 20 years line back in 2017. Sometimes when it comes to FNAF theorizing, we end up having to go back and look at this stuff through a different lens, or we suddenly come across something totally new. It really does feel like the most obvious answer, in my head at least, would be Happiest Day. Like I said before, it was literally supposed to be the end. If you look at this scene by itself, yeah, you'd think this represents the children's spirits finally being freed. This isn't the clarification or retroactive storytelling we talked about earlier. I can't stress enough that we've been told this was intended to be the end. Yes, with the gift of hindsight, we can give Happiest a new meaning now, but in doing so, we pretty much totally remove its original context. To me, personally, this makes the most sense for what the retcon could be. I know the argument would be if it's actually seamless. My argument would be that it's retroactively been made to be seamless because of what the minigame represents now. In a sense, it's having your cake and eating it too. No, the souls aren't being freed here anymore, but this is basically a step in the right direction to freeing them. And depending on who you ask, it's where the crying child's soul is freed at the very least. I think the reason I'd go against the puppet's gender from FNAF 2 being the retcon is because, arguably, that's not seamless. Yes, you could argue the whole animatronic being a male thing, but it ultimately just makes more sense for that minigame to be referring to the child himself as opposed to the animatronic character. If anything, this discussion we've had today just goes to show how shoddy of a claim Scott's post was. Really? Only one? I feel like if we really tried, we could probably find a few instances that look like actual retcons. Still, for all the faults he might have, I do think Scott has a clear idea of what the story is, and I do believe that he doesn't just change details on a whim. But in any case, I hope you enjoyed the video. Hopefully, at the very least, it was an interesting discussion. If you have any thoughts or opinions of your own, feel free to leave them down below in the comments. I always enjoy seeing what other people's takes are of a theory or topic. Feel free to also join my official Discord server if you want notifications for when I'm streaming or when I've posted a new video. If you're really feeling gracious, I'd certainly appreciate it if you left a like or even subscribed. Whatever you might do, I hope you have a good day or a good night, whichever it is for you. Without further ado, I will see you all next time. Peace out.